Nimrod, king of Shinar, was, according to the Book of Genesis and books of Chronicles, the son of Cush, the great-grandson of Noah. The Bible states that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, began to be mighty in the earth. Extra-biblical traditions associating him with the Tower of Babel led to his reputation as a king who was rebellious against God. Since the city of Akkad was destroyed and lost with the destruction of its empire in the period 2200–2154 BC, the stories mentioning Nimrod seem to recall the late Early Bronze Age. The association with Erech, a city that lost its prime importance around 2000 BC as a result of struggles between ISNI, Larsa and Elam, also attests the early provenance of the stories of Nimrod. Several Mesopotamian ruins were given Nimrod's name by 8th-century Arabs, including the ruins of the Assyrian city of Kalu, built by Shalmaneser I. A number of attempts to connect him with historical figures have been made. Biblical account. The first mention of Nimrod is in the Table of Nations. He is described as the son of Cush, grandson of Ham, and great-grandson of Noah, and as a mighty one in the earth, and a mighty hunter before the Lord. This is repeated in the first book of Chronicles chapter 1 verse 10, and the land of Nimrod, used as a synonym for Assyria or Mesopotamia, is mentioned in the book of Micah chapter 5 verse 6, and they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he cometh into our land, and when he treadeth within our borders. Genesis says that the beginning of his kingdom was the towns of Babel, Erech, Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar, understood variously to imply that he either founded these cities, ruled over them, or both. Owing to an ambiguity in the original Hebrew text, it is unclear whether it is he or Ashur who additionally built Nineveh, Resen, Rehoboth, Ayar and Kala. Sir Walter Raleigh devoted several pages in his History of the World to reciting past scholarship regarding the question of whether it had been Nimrod or Ashur who built the cities in Assyria. Traditions and legends. In Hebrew and Christian tradition, Nimrod is considered the leader of those who built the Tower of Babel in the land of Shinar, though the Bible never actually states this. Nimrod's kingdom included the cities of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and perhaps Calneh in Shinar. Therefore, it was likely under his direction that the building of Babel and its tower began, in addition to Flavius Josephus. This is also the view found in the Talmud, and later Midrash such as Genesis Rabbah. Several of these early Judaic sources also assert that the king Amraphel, who wars with Abraham later in Genesis, is none other than Nimrod himself, since Akkad was destroyed and lost with the destruction of its empire in the period 2200–2154 BCE. The stories mentioning Nimrod seem to recall the late Early Bronze Age. The association with Erech, a city that lost its prime importance around 2000 BCE as a result of struggles between ISNI, Larsa and Elam, also attests the early provenance of the stories of Nimrod. According to some modern-day theorists, the placement in the Bible suggests a Babylonian origin, possibly inserted during the Babylonian captivity. Judaic interpreters as early as Philo and Yochanan ben Zakkai interpreted a mighty hunter before the Lord as signifying in opposition to the Lord. A similar interpretation is found in Pseudo-Philo, as well as later in Symmachus. Some rabbinic commentators have also connected the name Nimrod with a Hebrew word meaning rebel. In Pseudo-Philo, Nimrod is made leader of the Hamites, while Joktan as leader of the Semites, and Phoenix as leader of the Japhethites, are also associated with the building of the tower. Versions of this story are again picked up in later works such as Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. The Book of Jubilees mentions that the name of Nimrod only as being the father of Azurad, the wife of Eber and mother of Peleg. This account would thus make him an ancestor of Abraham, and hence of all Hebrews. Josephus wrote, "Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God, if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers." Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God, and they built a tower, neither sparing any pains, nor being in any degree negligent about the work, and, by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than any one could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that thereby its great height seemed, upon the view, to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar, made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wise by the destruction of the former sinners, but he caused a tumult among them, by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that, through the multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language which they readily understood before, for the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. An early Arabic work known as Kitab al-Magal, the Book of Rolls, states that Nimrod built the towns of Hadanu and Elazar, Seleucia, Ctesiphon, Ruhun, Atrapatin, Tel Alan, and others, that he began his reign as king over earth when Reu was 163, and that he reigned for 69 years, building Nisibis, Raha, and Haran when Peleg was 50. It further adds that Nimrod saw in the sky a piece of black cloth and a crown. Quote, "He called upon Sasan the weaver and commanded him to make him a crown like it, which he set jewels on and wore. He was allegedly the first king to wear a crown. For this reason people who knew nothing about it said that a crown came down to him from heaven." Later, the book describes how Nimrod established fire worship and idolatry, then received instruction in divination for 3 years from Bunita, the fourth son of Noah. In the Recognitions, one version of the Clementines, Nimrod is equated with the legendary Assyrian king Ninus, who first appears in the Greek historian Ctesias as the founder of Nineveh. However, in another version, the Homilies, Nimrod is made to be the same as Zoroaster. The Syriac Cave of Treasures contains an account of Nimrod very similar to that in the Kitab al-Magal, except that Nisibis, Edessa and Haran are said to be built by Nimrod when Reu was 50, and that he began his reign as the first king when Reu was 130. In this version, the weaver is called Sizan, and the fourth son of Noah is called Yotan. Jerome, writing California, 390, explains in Hebrew Questions on Genesis that after Nimrod reigned in Babel, he also reigned in Iraq, that is, in Edessa, and in Akkad, which is now called Nisibis, and in Shalan, which was later called Seleucia after King Seleucus when its name had been changed, and which is now in actual fact called Ctesiphon. Quote, However, this traditional identification of the cities built by Nimrod in Genesis is no longer accepted by modern scholars, who consider them to be located in Sumer, not Syria. The GEEZ conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan also contains a version similar to that in the Cave of Treasures, but the crown maker is called Santal, and the name of Noah's fourth son who instructs Nimrod is Barvan. However, Ephraim the Syrian relates a contradictory view that Nimrod was righteous and opposed the builders of the tower. Similarly, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan mentions a Jewish tradition that Nimrod left Shinar in southern Mesopotamia and fled to Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, because he refused to take part in building the tower, for which God rewarded him with the 4 cities in Assyria, to substitute for the ones in Babel. Rabbi Eliezer relates the Jewish traditions that Nimrod inherited the garments of Adam and Eve from his father Cush, and that these made him invincible. Nimrod's party then defeated the Japhethites to assume universal rulership. Later, Esau ambushed, beheaded, and robbed Nimrod. These stories later reappear in other sources including the 16th-century Sefer HaYashar, which adds that Nimrod had a son named Mardon who was even more wicked. In the History of the Prophets and Kings by the 9th-century Muslim historian Al-Tabari, Nimrod has the tower built in Babel, Allah destroys it, and the language of mankind, formerly Syriac, is then confused into 72 languages. Another Muslim historian of the 13th century, Abu al-Fida, relates the same story, adding that the patriarch Eber was allowed to keep the original tongue, Hebrew in this case, because he would not partake in the building. The 10th century Muslim historian Masudi recounts a legend making the Nimrod who built the tower to be the son of Mash, the son of Aram, son of Shem, adding that he reigned 500 years over the Nabateans. Later, Masudi lists Nimrod as the first king of Babylon, and states that he dug great canals and reigned 60 years. Still elsewhere, he mentions another king, Nimrod, son of Canaan, as the one who introduced astrology and attempted to kill Abraham. In Armenian legend, the ancestor of the Armenian people, Haik, defeated Nimrod in a battle near Lake Van. In the Hungarian legend of the enchanted stag, King Nimrod is the first person referred to as forefather of the Hungarians. He, along with his entire nation, is also the giant responsible for the building of the Tower of Babel, construction of which was supposedly started by him 201 years after the event of the Great Flood. After the catastrophic failure of that most ambitious endeavor and in the midst of the ensuing linguistic cacophony, Nimrod the giant moved to the land of Evilah, where his wife Ene gave birth to twin brothers Hunner and Magyar. Father and sons were, all three of them, prodigious hunters, but Nimrod especially is the archetypal, consummate, legendary hunter and archer. Both the Huns and Magyars historically attested skill with the recurve bow and arrow are attributed to Nimrod. The twin sons of King Nimrod, Hunner and Magyar, each with 100 warriors, followed the white stag through the Meotis marsh, where they lost sight of the magnificent animal. Hunner and Magyar found the two daughters of King Dul of the Alans, together with the handmaidens whom they kidnapped. Hungarian legends held Hunner and Magyar to be ancestors of the Huns and the Magyars, respectively. According to the Miholjanek legend, Stephen V of Hungary had in front of his tent a golden plate with the inscription, Attila, the son of Benjusi, grandson of the great Nimrod, born at Engedi, by the grace of God, king of the Huns, Medes, Goths, Dacians, the horrors of the world and the scourge of God. Nimrod figures in some very early versions of the history of Freemasonry, where he was said to have been one of the fraternity's founders. According to the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, the legend of the craft in the old constitutions refers to Nimrod as one of the founders of Masonry. Thus in the Yorkmas, number 1, we read, "At ye making of ye Tower of Babel, there was a masonry first much esteemed of, and the king of Babylon white called Nimrod was a mason himself and loved well masons." Quote, however, he does not figure in the current rituals. The demon Nyriki, figuring in the Finnish Kalevala as a helper of Lemminkainen, is associated with Nimrod by some researchers and linguists. Evil Nimrod versus the righteous Abraham. The Bible does not mention any meeting between Nimrod and Abraham, although a confrontation between the two is said to have taken place, according to several Jewish and Islamic traditions. Some stories bring them both together in a cataclysmic collision, seen as a symbol of the confrontation between good and evil, and/or as a symbol of monotheism against polytheism. On the other hand, some Jewish traditions say only that the two men met and had a discussion. According to K. van der Toorn, P.W. van der Horst, this tradition is first attested in the writings of Pseudo-Philo. The story is also found in the Talmud, and in rabbinical writings in the Middle Ages. In some versions, Nimrod is a man who sets his will against that of God. In others, he proclaims himself a god and is worshipped as such by his subjects, sometimes with his consort Semiramis worshipped as a goddess at his side. A portent in the stars tells Nimrod and his astrologers of the impending birth of Abraham, who would put an end to idolatry. Nimrod therefore orders the killing of all newborn babies. However, Abraham's mother escapes into the fields and gives birth secretly. At a young age, Abraham recognizes God and starts worshipping him. He confronts Nimrod and tells him face to face to cease his idolatry, whereupon Nimrod orders him burned at the stake. In some versions, Nimrod has his subjects gather wood for 4 whole years, so as to burn Abraham in the biggest bonfire the world had ever seen. Yet when the fire is lit, Abraham walks out unscathed. In some versions, Nimrod then challenges Abraham to battle. When Nimrod appears at the head of enormous armies, Abraham produces an army of gnats which destroys Nimrod's army. Some accounts have a gnat mosquito enter Nimrod's brain and drive him out of his mind. In some versions, Nimrod repents and accepts God, offering numerous sacrifices that God rejects. Other versions have Nimrod give to Abraham, as a conciliatory gift, the giant slave Eliezer, whom some accounts describe as Nimrod's own son. Still other versions have Nimrod persisting in his rebellion against God, or resuming it. Indeed, Abraham's crucial act of leaving Mesopotamia and settling in Canaan is sometimes interpreted as an escape from Nimrod's revenge. Accounts considered canonical place the building of the tower many generations before Abraham's birth. However, in others, it is a later rebellion after Nimrod failed in his confrontation with Abraham. In still other versions, Nimrod does not give up after the tower fails, but goes on to try storming heaven in person, in a chariot driven by birds. The story attributes to Abraham elements from the story of Moses' birth and from the careers of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who emerged unscathed from the fire. Nimrod is thus given attributes of two archetypal cruel in persecuting kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh. Some Jewish traditions also identified him with Cyrus, whose birth according to Herodotus was accompanied by portents, which made his grandfather try to kill him. A confrontation is also found in the Quran, between the king, not mentioned by name, and the prophet Ibrahim. Muslim commentators assign Nimrod as the king based on Jewish sources. In Ibrahim's confrontation with the king, the former argues that Allah is the one who gives life and gives death. The king responds by bringing out two people sentenced to death. He releases one and kills the other, as a poor attempt at making a point that he also brings life and death. Ibrahim refutes him by stating that Allah brings the sun up from the east, and so he asks the king to bring it from the west. The king is then perplexed and angered. Whether or not conceived as having ultimately repented, Nimrod remained in Jewish and Islamic tradition an emblematic evil person, an archetype of an idolater and a tyrannical king. In rabbinical writings up to the present, he is almost invariably referred to as Nimrod the Evil. Nimrod is mentioned by name in several places in the Baha'i scriptures, including the Kitab IQAN, the primary theological work of the Baha'i religion. There it is said that Nimrod dreamed a dream, which his soothsayers interpreted as signifying the birth of a new star in heaven. A herald is then said to have appeared in the land announcing the coming of Abraham. Nimrod is also mentioned in one of the earliest writings of the Bab. Citing examples of God's power, he asks, has he not in past days caused Abraham, in spite of his seeming helplessness, to triumph over the forces of Nimrod? The story of Abraham's confrontation with Nimrod did not remain within the confines of learned writings and religious treatises, but also conspicuously influenced popular culture. A notable example is Quando El Rey Nimrod, one of the most well-known folk songs in Ladino, apparently written during the reign of King Alfonso X of Castile. Beginning with the words, when King Nimrod went out to the fields, looked at the heavens and at the stars, he saw a holy light in the Jewish quarter, a sign that Abraham, our father, was about to be born. The song gives a poetic account of the persecutions perpetrated by the cruel Nimrod and the miraculous birth and deeds of the Savior Abraham. Islamic narrative. According to the Islamic narrative, Abraham seems to debate and have series of discussions with Nimrod. The Quran states to Nimrod, have you not considered him who had an argument with Abraham about his Lord, because God had given him the kingdom? Abraham say, my Lord is he who gives life and causes death. He answered, I give life and cause death. The king brought forth two men sentenced to death. He freed one and condemned the other. Then Abraham stated, indeed, God brings up the sun from the east, so bring it up from the west. Then the Nimrod exiled him and he left for Levant. Although Nimrod's name is not stated in the Quran, it has been held by Islamic scholars that it was him. Also, he was apparently a ruler of the whole earth. Mujahid said, 4 people gained control over the earth, east and west, 2 believers and 2 disbelievers. The 2 believers were Solomon and Dul-Kamine, and the 2 disbelievers were Nebuchadnezzar and Nimrod. No one but they gained power over it. Text of the Midrash Rabbah version. The following version of the Abraham versus Nimrod confrontation appears in the Midrash Rabbah, a major compilation of Jewish scriptural exegesis. The part relating to Genesis, in which this appears, is considered to date from the 6th century. Historical interpretations. Historians, Orientalists, Assyriologists and mythographers have long tried to find links between Nimrod and historically attested figures in Mesopotamia. The Christian bishop Eusebius of Caesarea as early as the early 4th century, noting that the Babylonian historian Berossus in the 3rd century BC had stated that the first king after the flood was Euchaios of Chaldea, identified him with Nimrod. George Syncellus also had access to Berossus, and he too identified Euchaios with the biblical Nimrod. More recently, Sumerologists have suggested additionally connecting both this Euchaios and the king of Babylon and grandfather of Gilgamesh, who appears in the oldest copies of Elian as Euchoros, with the name of the founder of Uruk known from cuneiform sources as Enmerkar. In 1920, J.D. Prince also suggested a possible link between the Lord of Marad and Nimrod. He mentioned how dry Kraling was now inclined to connect Nimrod historically with Lugal-Banda, a mythological king mentioned in Pobal historical texts, 1914, whose seat was at the city Marad. This is supported by Theodore Jacobson in 1989, writing on Lugal-Banda and Ninsuna. According to Ronald Hendel, the name Nimrod is probably a polemical distortion of the god Ninurta, a prominent god in Mesopotamian religion who had cult centers in a number of Assyrian cities such as Kalu, and also in Babylon, and was a patron god of a number of Assyrian kings. Nimrod's imperial ventures described in Genesis may be based on the conquests of the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I. Julian Jaynes also indicates Tukulti-Ninurta I as the origin for Nimrod. Alexander Hislop, in his tract The Two Babylons, decided that Nimrod was to be identified with Ninus, who according to Greek legend was a Mesopotamian king and husband of Semiramis, with a whole host of deities throughout the Mediterranean world, and with the Persian Zoroaster. The identification with Ninus follows that of the Clementine recognitions, the one with Zoroaster, that of the Clementine Homilies, both works part of Clementine literature. There was a historical Assyrian queen Shamuramat in the 9th century, the wife of Shamshi-Adad V, whom some speculations have identified with Semiramis, while others make her a later namesake of a much earlier Semiramis. In David Roll's theory, Enmerkar, the Sumerian founder of Uruk, was the original inspiration for Nimrod. Because the story of Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta bears a few similarities to the legend of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, and because the Kar in Enmerkar means hunter. Additionally, Enmerkar is said to have had ziggurats built in both Uruk and Eridu, which Roll postulates was the site of the original Babel. George Rawlinson believed Nimrod was Belus based on the fact Babylonian and Assyrian inscriptions bear the names Bel-Nibru. The word Nibru in the Akkadian language of Assyria and Babylonia comes from a root meaning to pursue, or to make one flee. And as Rawlinson pointed out, not only does this closely resemble Nimrod's name, but it also perfectly fits the description of Nimrod in Genesis chapter 10:9 as a great hunter. The Belus-Nimrod equation, a link, is also found in many old works such as Moses of Chorene and the Book of the Bee. Nibru, in the Sumerian language, was the original name of the city of Nippur. Joseph Poplicher wrote in 1929 about the identification of Nimrod in the First Dynasty or Uruk, because another of the cities said to have been built by Nimrod was Akkad, an older theory proposed by 1910. He connects him with Sargon the Great, grandfather of Naram-Sin, since, according to the Sumerian king list, that king first built Akkad. Sargon was known from archaeology by 1860, and for some time remained the earliest known Mesopotamian ruler. The assertion of the king list that it was Sargon who built Akkad has since been called into question. However, with the discovery of inscriptions mentioning the place in the reigns of some of Sargon's predecessors, such as kings in Shakushana and Lugal-Zarshi of Uruk. Moreover, Sargon was credited with founding Babylon in the Babylonian Chronicle, another city attributed to Nimrod in Genesis. However, a different tablet suggests that Sargon merely dug up the dirt of the pit of the original Babylon, and rebuilt it in its later location fronting Akkad. Yigal-Levin suggests that Nimrod was a recollection of Sargon of Akkad and of his grandson Naram-Sin, with the name Nimrod derived from the latter idiom. In contemporary American English, the term is now commonly used to mean a dim-witted or a stupid person, a usage first recorded in 1932 and popularized by the cartoon character Bugs Bunny, who sarcastically refers to the hunter Elmer Fudd as Nimrod, as an ironic connection between Mighty Hunter and Poor Little Nimrod, i.e., Fudd.